Journal entry number 4. The grain that wouldn't leave. There is a familiar story about how a pearl begins. A tiny grain enters the shell of a mollusk. It is small, almost insignificant, but it does not belong there. It rubs against something soft. It irritates, and the creature cannot simply ask it to leave. So, slowly, it begins covering the intruder. One delicate layer, then another, then another. Not because it is trying to create something beautiful, not because it understands symbolism, and certainly not because it has plans to open a jewelry shop. It is simply responding to discomfort, protecting what is tender. And over time, the thing that did not belong becomes surrounded by something luminous. A pearl forms around the irritation. The scientific reality is a little less tidy than the story. Pearls do not always begin with a perfect grain of sand. The irritant may be a parasite, a fragment, or some other tiny intrusion. But perhaps the more complicated truth makes the image even more interesting. Something enters, something disturbs, and the living creature begins the slow work of responding. I wonder how often our own learning begins that way. Not with excitement, not with confidence, but with something that bothers us. A question we cannot answer. A mistake we keep repeating. A sentence we do not understand. A criticism we cannot quite dismiss. A problem that follows us home and sits quietly at the edge of the evening. Some ideas arrive like invitations. Others arrive like grains. They scratch. They refuse to settle. And because they refuse to settle, we keep returning to them. Perhaps curiosity is not always pleasant. We often describe it as bright and playful. A child opening drawers. A traveller taking an unfamiliar road. A reader following an interesting footnote. But curiosity can also begin as irritation. Why does this not make sense? Why did that attempt fail? Why does this explanation feel incomplete? Why does the answer everyone accepts continue to trouble me? There are questions that sparkle, and there are questions that itch. Sometimes the second kind stays with us longer. Imagine learning a piece of music. Most of it begins to flow. The hands remember where to go. The rhythm becomes familiar. But there is one small passage that refuses to cooperate. 4 bars, perhaps only 2. Every time they arrive, the music stumbles. The fingers tighten. The tempo collapses. The learner starts again. And again. And perhaps, after the 6th attempt, feels a sudden desire to become interested in gardening instead. That awkward passage can feel like an interruption. Everything would be going beautifully if it were not there. But what if that passage is not interrupting the learning? What if it is revealing where the learning needs to happen? The irritation points towards the unfinished place. It shows where attention is still required. Without it, the learner might play the familiar sections forever and mistake comfort for mastery. The same thing happens when we write. A paragraph may look complete. The grammar is correct. The sentences are respectable. And yet something feels wrong. The thought has not quite arrived. We move a sentence, delete it, restore it, read the paragraph aloud. Still wrong. Why does it refuse to settle? Perhaps the problem is not the paragraph. Perhaps the problem is that we have not yet decided what we truly mean. The irritation in the writing may be an irritation in the thinking. And until the thought becomes clearer, the sentence keeps scratching. Some difficulties disappear when we solve them. Others become part of us. A misunderstanding is corrected. A technique improves. A difficult chapter eventually opens. But certain experiences cannot simply be removed. A failure remains in memory. A rejection changes how we enter the next room. An abandoned project continues to ask what might have happened. A teacher's careless remark stays far longer than the teacher ever imagined. What happens when the grain cannot be taken out? What forms around it? There is a danger in the pearl metaphor. It can make suffering sound too convenient, as though every wound becomes wisdom, as though time automatically turns pain into beauty. It does not. Some experiences simply hurt. Some difficulties exhaust rather than strengthen. Some irritations need to be removed, not romanticized. A harmful situation is not a lesson we are required to treasure. And no one owes the world a pearl simply because something wounded them. But perhaps there is still a quieter truth here. We may not control every grain that enters our lives, yet we participate in what gathers around it. The layers do not appear all at once. They form through repeated response. The story we tell, the question we ask, the meaning we revise, the patience we offer ourselves, the willingness to return without pretending the irritation never existed. What happens when a mistake is met only with shame? It may remain sharp. What happens when the same mistake is examined with curiosity? A layer begins to form. Not a layer that hides what happened, a layer that makes the experience safer to hold. We notice what led to it. We recognize a pattern. We understand what we did not understand before. The mistake remains part of the story, but it no longer cuts in quite the same way. Perhaps reflection is one of the ways we create those layers. An experience happens, then we revisit it. At first, we may have only emotion, embarrassment, anger, confusion. Later, language arrives. We begin to describe what happened. Still later, a question appears. What was I expecting? What did I miss? What was I protecting? What would I recognize sooner now? The event has not changed, but our relationship to it has. Another layer, then another. This may be why journals matter. A journal does not remove the grain, it gives us somewhere to sit beside it. On one page, we record the irritation. On another, we notice a pattern. Weeks later, we return and discover that the question has changed. We thought we were asking, why did this happen to me? Now perhaps we are asking, what is this showing me? Not every page contains an answer. Some pages simply make the discomfort more precise, and precision can be a kind of relief. A vague pain fills the whole room. A named question can sit on the table. Could learning itself be a process of forming layers around confusion? At first, a new subject feels foreign. Its vocabulary scratches against what we already know. Nothing fits. Then, one explanation settles over the confusion. Another example follows. A mistake adds detail. A conversation changes the shape again. Slowly, the unfamiliar idea becomes something we can hold. Not because the original difficulty vanished, but because understanding formed around it. Consider a learner who once believed, "I am simply bad at mathematics." That sentence may have begun with one moment, A problem at the board, a red mark on a page, a comparison with someone faster. The grain enters. Years pass, and the belief gathers layers of its own. Avoidance, embarrassment, defensiveness, perhaps humour. I'm just not a maths person. A joke can be a very elegant piece of armour. But what might happen if the learner returned? Not to prove the old belief wrong in one dramatic afternoon, only to look at it more closely. Was the problem truly inability, or was it speed? Was it a missing foundation? Was it fear? Was it the way the subject was taught? Was one difficult moment allowed to become an identity? These questions do not erase the grain, but they may change what forms around it. There are irritations that make us smaller. We avoid, we withdraw, we protect ourselves by refusing to try again. And there are irritations that slowly deepen our attention. They teach us to notice, to listen longer, to question the first explanation. What makes the difference? Perhaps there is no single answer. Support matters. Safety matters. Time matters. The size of the wound matters. And sometimes, readiness matters. An experience we could not understand at 20 may become clearer at 40. Not because the past changed, because we did. A pearl takes time. That may be the part of the metaphor we most easily overlook. We like the before and after, the rough grain, the finished pearl. But the real story is in the invisible middle. Layer after layer, formed when nobody is watching. No dramatic transformation, no announcement. Only a quiet response repeated over time. Perhaps many kinds of growth look like that. A learner returns to the instrument. A writer opens the abandoned draft. A person hears criticism without immediately collapsing beneath it. Someone asks the question they were once too embarrassed to ask. Nothing about these moments looks extraordinary, but a layer forms. A little more patience, a little more understanding, a little less fear. And perhaps this is why progress can be difficult to recognize from the inside. We still feel the grain. We assume nothing has changed. But change may be happening around it. The memory is still there, but it no longer controls every decision. The difficult subject is still difficult, but difficulty no longer feels like a verdict. The question remains unanswered, but uncertainty has become more bearable. Is that not a kind of transformation? Not the removal of discomfort, the ability to hold it differently. There is also something humbling about a pearl. Its beauty does not come from purity, it comes from response. The pearl is not beautiful because nothing disturbed the mollusc. It is beautiful because something did, and because the creature met that disturbance with a patient, protective act. Again, and again, and again. I wonder which grains we are carrying now. Which question continues to scratch beneath an otherwise ordinary day? Which mistake still feels sharper than it needs to? Which unfinished skill keeps returning to mind? Which criticism remains because some small part of it may contain something worth examining? And which irritation does not need a lesson at all? Only distance, rest, or permission to let go. Not every grain becomes a pearl. Not every discomfort should remain. Some questions deserve time. Some failures deserve a second reading. Some difficult passages may be pointing towards the exact place where understanding is trying to form. We do not choose every grain that enters our lives, but slowly, patiently, we may choose what forms around it. Perhaps growth is not always the moment the irritation disappears. Perhaps it is the moment we realize we can carry it without being cut in the same way. That's today's entry. I'd love to hear where this idea takes you. Is there something that once felt like an irritation, but has slowly become part of what you now understand? Until the next page, stay curious.